Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The Exile's Return. Episode 7. Chapter 37. Derek POV. He had nearly fallen out of his bed when he'd been woken by his father mind-linking him that Stephen had brought Kellen to the alpha floor. He was completely naked and moved to his walk-in robe and pulled a t-shirt and jeans off the hangers, yanked them on and headed out to greet them. Didn't much worry about his appearance. She'd seen him half asleep many times, actually always told him he looked *XY when half asleep. He'd stepped out of his suite, hopefully soon their suite. He had not been expecting the triplets as his father had not mentioned that. He ran his hair through his messy bed hair and headed towards them. His mother was already talking to them, couldn't wait to introduce herself to her grandbaddies, it seemed. He had been surprised by Kellen's lack of anger in his direction. Something had changed, or, perhaps after this morning, Havoc's display of wanting to mark her. She was either willing to accept him or worried any display of withdrawal or rejection would get her forcibly marked by his wolf. Either way, it was nice to see her in this state. Even nicer to watch her slide her eyes over him and take him in. He couldn't help but smile at her. Havoc piped up in his mind. I can work with that, he thought, going over there. She even seemed embarrassed that he'd caught her checking him out. She could do it all day every day as far as he was concerned. To his great delight, the twins took right to him, and when they had launched themselves right into his arms after he had picked them apart, his team of warriors who had been watching them had let him know that the only difference they could see was Lily was more up front and Rosalie quieter. Seeing as the girl had grabbed onto him and directly asked him if he was her father, she could only be Lily, but he had looked her over, and her sister, they indeed were identical, just taking his time before letting her know he did know who she was. It had made them both very happy that he knew them apart. Their scents were ever so slightly different, that would be a great help. He could well imagine the mischief they would try to get up to later in life, especially if they were anything like their mother. Being identical, probably try to trick him as to who they were to avoid punishment at some point. He'd caught Kellen's reaction to the twins and him hugging. He was instantly concerned, didn't know if it was happy or sadness. He'd also seen Stephen reach out and touch her to comfort her, and when she had regained her composure and found him looking at her, she had waved him off, clearly not wanting to talk about it. They were going to have to. Nate, on the other hand, a very reserved, angry little one, took a shot at him about him not being around to look after his sisters. Very much the alpha and ready to fight it out. But then, to his surprise, he had walked over and clutched his mother's hand like it was a lifeline, like he needed her to comfort him. Even an alpha will always want their mummy, his father mind-linked him, his tone full of amusement. He'd walked them down to, hopefully their suite soon, and pushed both doors open for them to walk in. The girls were off looking at things. Nate stayed with his mother. He could see her worry and tried to reduce it by letting her know she could leave the room anytime she liked, but he didn't really want her to. When he'd mentioned the words "our babies" and Arya had purred so loudly, he couldn't help but chuckle. Thank the goddess, she was on his side, 3 against 1 at this point. They twins were off with excitement at seeing their rooms. He'd actually installed an adjoining door between their rooms. He thought they might want that. He'd had it done the day after he'd found out about them being his. He stayed with Kellen and Nate. He could tell the twins were fine. She'd walked into his room after him but had stopped just inside the door. He'd simply followed and allowed himself to watch her. She was wearing clothes from olden days. Actually, if he recalled correctly, he had removed this very shirt from her body once before. He leaned on the door frame only a foot away and just watched her, enjoyed being this close to her, smelling her scent. It was wonderful to actually be this close to her and not have her trying to run away. Though he knew it was driving up his desire to mark and mate her, with every minute she stood this close to him, and he could see the love bite Havoc had left on her. His mark would be permanent. When he'd spoken to Nate, her entire body had frozen. She clearly had not realized just how close he was to her. Perhaps Arya was purposely not trying to smell him to keep her from realizing how close he was. Her beautiful jewel green eyes had turned on him and he hadn't been about to help himself bring up their bedroom, and the seductive undertone of his voice was automatically pulled from him. Her eyes had always been his undoing and now it seemed was no different. He wanted her and he wanted her to know it, just like he had always wanted her to know. It was more need at this point, as he was trying to convince her that he was of no threat to her, that he did indeed want this bond, did want her to be his mate, his Luna and goddess, help him, the mother to their future children, because, yes, he wanted to put a pup in her and if she would let him he would do it right now, to see her swollen with his unborn child. His desire was increasing by the minute. He watched as she practically ran to the other side of the room away from him, and couldn't help but smile. She was afraid he was going to seduce her, he would at some point, could only imagine that if the children weren't all here he would be already trying. Derek knew she was not coming out of this room with him standing in the doorway. "I'll go check on the girls. Why don't you help Nate find some winter clothing from the wardrobe?" And he left her alone with Mate. Still smiling to himself, it seemed she was feeling the mate bond, though was still trying to fight it. He chuckled to himself, "Ah, now that is a losing battle," considering he was going to be as close to her as was possible to help it get stronger, until she couldn't deny it anymore, deny him. Her days of defiance were over now. Even Havoc chortled at that thought. He found the twins had already made a mess in both their rooms, toys were pulled out and strewn about the rooms and both beds had clearly been jumped on. They were currently eating snacks from their snack corner. "Girls, how about we get you some warm clothes on, go over there and pick something warm out." They turned those green eyes on him, smiling up at him. "Okay," they both said at the same time, and run off to Rosalie's wardrobe to find something to wear. They were so freaking adorable, he was never going to be able to punish them, those darned green eyes would sink him every time. He wondered if this was what his parents felt for Abby and why they couldn't punish her. Guess it was a Kellen chore. He was certain she had disciplined them already. Being a single parent, there was no other choice. He stood and watched from the doorway as they helped dress each other in warm clothing and came out with big pink puffy jackets with fur around the hoods and long pants with little boots. How was it even possible that they got cuter in the last 5 minutes? Even Havoc was watching them intently, his tail flicking back and forth happily as he watched them. He would have to get Kellen's permission to let Havoc out to meet them, though his wolf had never been so happy in all his life. Clearly having Arya as a mate was good for him, not to mention they had gone from being alone to having a mate and children, 3 of them, instant family. He headed out of the room and the twins went running into Nate's room. He was in there putting shoes on. Kellen was sitting on the edge of the bed watching him, she was holding a black jacket for him to put on. The twins ran right up to her talking a mile a minute about their rooms, how there were fairy and unicorn toys and dolls to play with, how everything was all pink, purple and sparkly. They climbed up on Nate's bed and were already jumping on it. But then they complained that his bed was bigger than either of theirs. Which it was, an alpha male would need a bigger bed than an alpha female and he had thought about this. Nate's room was sporting a queen-sized bed where both the girls only had single beds. "That's not why you did it," Havoc piped up and chortled at him. "I don't want boys in my girls' rooms," Derek muttered. He knew it too, but was trying to convince himself he wasn't going to be the overprotecting father figure. Yes, you will. Havoc chortled again. L will be. Kellen, what are your and the children's plans for the day? Not much. Find them warm clothes, maybe find Ray Ray and hang out. How'd you know Ray Ray is here? He questioned. He had yet to tell her that. The smirk that crossed her face practically melted his heart. She was looking directly at him with full-blown amusement in her eyes. If the children weren't in this room, he would be on her so fast she wouldn't know what hit her. I watched you all arrive home last night. Arya and I were hiding a snowdrift. She nearly laughed and he loved it. He didn't care she'd escaped from him. Right this minute, just seeing her that happy, even at his expense, made him happy. I told you Elle smelled Arya. Havoc muttered at him. Sorry buddy, next time I'll listen, he promised. Havoc nearly looked right at us, but I'm guessing you thought I was still Elle in the Luna suite and didn't listen to him, or convinced him we weren't out there. She was chuckling and he could hear Arya along with her. They were both amused that they had gotten away and hidden from him. He did note the hesitation. She obviously didn't want their children to think he had locked her up, put everyone above herself. He thought, even his reputation, didn't want to make him look bad in their children's eyes. She really was too good for him. Was a great shock indeed. He nodded, then shot through the mind link. You ever climb 5 stories down the drain pipe again and I will put you across my knee and let Havoc suck*k out of you. His tone was firm but still playful. Havoc pushed his way to the surface right there in front of her and the children. I'll *ck you good and proper, he growled playfully at her. Kellen raised an eyebrow in response, but he heard Arya chortle softly. All of the children were staring at him now. This was unexpected and they had no context for his sudden comment either. Derek had been going to wait a few days. Havoc turned his eyes on them one at a time to really look at his children. Kellen was watching from her seat. He could see Arya on the surface now too. They didn't seem afraid of him, just watching. The twins had stopped jumping up and down on the bed and were looking at him with interest, probably the first time seeing a wolf other than Arya. Nate stood up from tying his shoe and stepped over to the bed, climbed up and stood right in front of the twins. Their protector as always. Not that Havoc would ever hurt them. He was just finally getting to see his pups for the first time. Mine. He growled softly, and then retreated. Sorry, Derek apologized, thought we were going to wait for that a few days. I guess Havoc changed his mind. I hope he didn't frighten you, he directed at the children. They all just shook their heads. He was more than relieved that they weren't afraid of his wolf. I'm starving. Let's go eat, he said, heading for the door. As they all walked out, Lily piped up, Daddy, where is Mummy's room? We all got one, did Mummy? Derek's heart skipped a beat and he was hard-pressed to keep the happy howl from Havoc inside of him. As he turned and looked down at his very expected daughter who had just called him Daddy for the first time, he could not, however, stop the moisture filling his eyes at the joy of hearing just that one word, Daddy. He blinked rapidly and tried to push the tears of joy about to spill down his face. Yes she does. He cleared his throat and looked right at Kellen. She was staring at him now, and appeared shocked by his reaction to their daughter's words. He tried to shake it off, but he was too darn happy. She can stay with me, in the master bedroom. Or if that doesn't suit her yet, in one of the other rooms down the hall from you. Her shock was gone and turned to a deep frown. I never said we would be staying in there. He watched as 3 sets of eyes turned on her questioningly. Even Nate, it seemed, was expecting to stay in his room, seeing as he had one. We can discuss it later, Derek nodded. Let's just go eat. Kellen, you and I will have to sit down and really talk later, perhaps over dinner? Just the two of us. And just where would my children be? Our children can be with either one of our parents or both of them if you like. Fine, I want some answers, anyway. Chapter 38. Kellen POV. It had shocked her to hear Lily call him daddy, her eyes had widened, but it was more shocking to see Derek nearly cry. The look on his face said it all, he had actually loved hearing it, she could see the joy on his face at just that one word. She knew right at that moment he would never let a single soul hurt them, he did love them. He loved her children. Their children. When he had answered Lily within his room she had frowned. Did he think she was just going roll over for him and do as he wanted? She still had some choices, and when her children had all looked at her when she had told him she had not agreed to them staying in the Alpha suite in the rooms he had prepared for them, it was clear not only were they all expecting it, they all wanted to. They were going to make her stay in the Alpha suite. She could see it coming, she would be guilted into it by the big green eyes, though she would not be in his bed, she could have a room down by theirs apparently. He had offered them the Luna suite earlier. Maybe she could stay there. It was just down the hall. Not separating us from pups, Kellen. Arya piped up. Elle can't handle this yet. Arya, I know what you want, how do I know you won't just move my sleeping body at will into his bed? Arya chortled at her. I could do that even from the Luna suite if I wanted to. Kellen sighed. It was a losing battle. Yes it is. Give in quickly. I want to be able to talk to my mate. When Derek told her that they needed to talk, she agreed to it. She needed answers and she wanted to keep Arya placated. Her wolf was obsessed with her being marked and mated, mostly because she wanted access to her mate. Kellen actively working on their bond would help keep Arya happy and hopefully not steal her body to take it to her mate. Which Arya had clearly thought about doing, it was all in her tone. The day was long and she was very tired. Derek had found Ray Ray and left her and the triplets with her. Michael had walked away from her, though the look he gave her said he felt guilty and he'd asked if he could speak with her at some point alone. Kellen just shrugged and nodded, she didn't really have much to say to him right now, had too much going on in her own world. They were in Ray Ray's room on the first floor, just sitting and chatting. Ray Ray was happy to be here, she'd spent the entire morning with Michael and they'd held hands all day and she'd been a little embarrassed by other couples who seemed to have no boundaries when it came to displays of affection for each other. Kellen was listening to her prattle on about her time here, while the triplets were watching a movie, and then she was being woken up, hadn't even realized she'd fallen asleep. Her eyes blinked a couple of times and finally, a face came into view. It was her mother, Vera, all healed now and out of the hospital. Mum, what time is it? Nearly 7, baby girl, don't you have dinner plans? Kellen stared at her for a moment confused, then groaned and rolled over and buried herself back into the blanket that was covering her. I'm too tired. Her mother laughed. Oh, you can't play that game, Ray Ray here says you've been asleep for hours. But I was awake all night, Arya kept me up, Kellen grumbled, and it was true, she and Havoc running around mating all night. Her mother poked her in the ribs. Come on, get up, I brought you something to wear, and Ray Ray said she'll do your makeup. Kellen pulled the blanket tighter around her. I don't wanna go, she muttered. Yes you do, you can't ignore the man you've been in love with all your life, anymore. What? She heard Ray Ray yell, completely surprised by her mother's words. Kellen pulled the blanket over her head and tried to ignore them. She could feel the blankets being yanked on and pulled at to try and make her get up. Yes, I can, she said defiantly. Her mother burst out laughing and finally pulled the blanket off of her. Get your butt up and into the shower, or you will be late. What can he do if I'm late? She muttered. Sitting herself up, nothing technically, she was the future Luna and no one could touch her. He heard Ray Ray laugh. Michael always threatens me that if I'm naughty, you might get bullied too. Do you really love him? Derek. Kellen sighed. It's complicated, Ray Ray. No, it's not. You told me once, you believe in love at first sight. He's the one, isn't he? Kellen got herself up off the couch. Where is the bathroom? She mumbled. A shower was better than this conversation. 30 minutes later, she was frowning at herself in the mirror. The dress her mother had picked out was, although absolutely gorgeous, a lace dress with white underlay and soft pink lace over the top. It was off the shoulder and fitted all the way down her body like a glove to her hips, then flared out slightly to give a full skirt that swished when she walked, falling to mid-thigh. Inappropriate as far as she was concerned. It was way a dress to be wearing in front of him. Havoc had already nearly marked her this morning, and his love bite was there for all to see. Even Ray Ray had commented on it, asked her who had given it to her while she was braiding her hair loosely. She'd left out a few tendrils on either side of her face. Vera had been no help. She really liked Ray Ray. Most people did. She was a happy chatty thing, and had told her Derek had given it to her that morning. Kellen had glared at her mother while Ray Ray had gasped in shock. He moves fast, she'd giggled. Vera giggled right back. Everyone here does, kind of our thing, she'd explained to her. Ray Ray had done Kellen's makeup. It was light and natural with soft pink lipstick to match her dress. And she was wearing small white pumps, too short for her liking. She much preferred her stilettos, but again probably not suitable for this dinner. Mother, you do know this dinner is not a date, right? She watched as her and Ray Ray laughed again. Goddess help me, she's been sucked in already. Go and have dinner. You do remember where the private dining room is? Blah blah blah, Kellen muttered as she left them alone. She knew the triplets were upstairs with Derek's parents and that hers would be headed up there momentarily as well. They had all wanted to watch the triplets, so they 4 of them were going to do it. In the Alpha Suite, that way, if the children crashed out, they could easily be put to bed. She made her way to the private dining room on the ground floor. It was in the East Wing past the Alpha's office and on the way to the ballroom where all important functions would be held. The door was open when she got there. Derek was already inside, standing with a drink in his hand. He was wearing a pale grey suit and dark grey dress shirt. Not a date, she thought to herself. Supposed to be just sorting things out over dinner. Yet there he was with hair neatly styled, clean-shaven, dressed to the nines and smelling delicious, though she knew it wasn't cologne, it was his scent, the one that identified him as her mate. His blue eyes moved to her, slid down over her slowly taking in what she was wearing and a smile spread across his lips. As his eyes reached hers she could already see the desire in them. Not a date. She reminded herself. You look beautiful. His voice was soft and husky. I didn't pick it, Mother did, she stated flatly, trying to ignore the way he was looking at her. Then I must thank her personally. He walked over to the table and pulled out a chair for her. Kellen sighed. This is not a date, you know that, right? She stated as she walked over and sat down in the chair he was holding for her. His chuckle tickled her insides. He leaned down and murmured softly in her ear, his lips brushing gently on them. I know, Kellen, but it could be him. And then he allowed his hands to run up both her arms from elbow to shoulder. Her skin sparked with electricity all the way up her arms as his touched her. She sucked in a deep breath as she felt his lips press against her ear in the lightest kiss she had ever felt. I would love it to be a date, he whispered to her. Then he moved away and sat down across from her. Her heart rate was beating twice as fast as normal, and she knew she was holding her breath but could help it. Somehow she had forgotten how to exhale. He was smiling right at her, his desire for her was clear to be seen and he wanted her to see it. That was for certain, for he was not even attempting to hide it from her. "Breath," he said a moment later, his voice back to normal. She expelled the held breath and felt embarrassed that he could have such an effect on her. She'd always loved him but he'd never made her forget how to breathe before. This could be problematic. "Not a date," she muttered. Heard him chuckle again. "Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself?" he asked teasingly. She shook her head. "I need you to stop this, for a moment." She looked directly at him. "I really do need answers from you." "I know," he nodded. "I will answer them, but I can't help how the bond affects either of us, Kellen. It is very strong even for me, stronger than my last one, I can assure you of that. So let's start there then. What happened between you and your mate? And when did it happen?" He waited until the young Omega girl who had just walked into the room to serve them their first course to leave and close the door behind her before answering the question. She was a terrible mate, lazy, greedy and unfaithful. It ended after 3.5 years. Kellen stared at him. That was not what she expected him to say. She had not known what he was going to say. But unfaithful, who would cheat on him? She shook her head. He was drop-dead gorgeous and in bed could make you scream with pleasure all night long. Elaborate please, he stared at her. Do you really need to know how much it hurt me, Layla? It's hot about that, I don't understand is all. Lazy, greedy, unfaithful? Put a little clarity into that sentence please. I understand you may not want to talk about it, but I would like to know, considering she was the reason I was banished, I think I have a right to know a little bit more than 3 words. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Sophia was very materialistic, refused to learn Luna duties from mother, refused to train to defend herself, refused to produce an heir, was never happy with anything I did for her, bought for her. The only thing we were compatible with was S*X. She rejected me when I cut off her access to the PAC's funding. I tried to fix it. She didn't seem to care and started flirting with any male around, ended up one only to have Havoc kill him. We were officially over a week later. Elle accepted her rejection and sent her back to where she came from. Kellen was just staring at him, mouth open now. She had asked for elaboration and she had gotten it. Still completely shocked by it though. She guessed that answered her question about whether he'd had children with her. No. Havoc killed him, she queried after pulling herself together, and when he sighed and looked like he did not want to answer it, continued, I'm not worried about Havoc hurting me or the children if that is what you're thinking, just curious is all. He was hurting and I was in agony. He took over and when he found them together he shrugged. Kellen decided to let it go. There seemed to be more there but clearly he didn't want to talk about it. She really didn't know what to say at all at that point. Picked up the glass of wine in front of her and sipped it, while quietly contemplating her next question. She was watching him. He had not eaten anything, was just holding his fork in his hand above the seared scallops on his plate. I'm sorry, she said softly. I'm not, he stated flatly and put his fork down. Clearly his appetite was gone. How long have you and Timothy been together? He asked her calmly, but there was a slight edge to his voice. 2 years, she answered simply. Honestly. Do you love him? No, she shook her head. Do you want to know about him and I? He was tapping the middle finger of his right hand on the table next to his dinner plate, staring at the wall across the room. She recalled he only did that when he was thinking over something he didn't know if he wanted the answer to. She would wait if he didn't want to know, that was fine. Is he going to be a problem? Come looking for you? I doubt it, but I don't really know either. Would you have married him? She frowned at him. Why would you even ask that? His eyes turned to her because he asked when you were going to marry him. Oh, that, he'd been doing that for 6 months or so. It was a funny joke, and no, I had no intention of ever marrying him. 2 years, Kellen, I want to know what he was to you. His tone was a little harsh, for her liking, but she guessed being that he was her mate, just talking about it was painful. Considering he'd obviously had to see her with him, or it was reported to him. Technically, she was still with him. There had been no breakup between them yet. A friend who was good stress relief, she shrugged. That's it? That is your explanation? Yes, if you want all the details, I will tell you, but I don't think you need to know them. I do not love him, I never loved him, he was just a way not to feel so lonely and unwanted. He ran a hand over his face and through his hair, messing it up, stared up at the ceiling for a long minute, then looked right at her. I'm sorry I made you feel lonely and unwanted, Kellen. I know this is hard for you, considering our history, but Elle honestly was an idiot and acted irrationally and impulsively that day. I should never have said those words to you. She shrugged. He couldn't take it back, no one could. It would always be there somewhere inside her and him. It occurred to her a few minutes later that maybe he was expecting her to forgive him, and she hadn't. She knew at some point she would be able to, but right now she couldn't. Years of pain and stress don't just vanish in a matter of minutes. The next course arrived and she saw him stare at it. He wasn't going to eat it, it was unlikely either of them would eat at this rate. Why did you want me to come home? She asked after way too much silence was happening. Havoc demanded it. We saw you on TV and he wouldn't let up on it. Why wouldn't you come home or even reply to the letter? Scared, figured you'd finally taken over and you and your mate were going to punish me for hitting her that one time. I had children to protect. Did you think I was so petty, Kellen? You'd known me for 20 years, went out with me for over a year. Was Elle ever the type to hold a grudge for something like that? She shrugged. I had known you for 20 years, we had a fun happy fling and then, in the matter of a day, I was nothing to you, and you did banish me over it. You were a different person, couldn't even stand to look at me that day, if I recall correctly. Again he ran his hand through his hair, so much like his father, but considering he had grown up learning how to be an alpha from Blaine, it was only natural that he would pick up on some of the former alpha's mannerisms. He sighed. Perhaps he'd not thought this conversation through. If you don't want to talk about this, we don't have to. His eyes were on her now. We have to do it at some point. I would like to get it out of the way. It's just difficult, for both of us, I see. But you're right. I was a different person, and to be honest with you, Sophia made me a different person. I have very little patience, I anger easily and sometimes even our pack fears me, or Havoc, or both of us. Havoc can be a bit of a nightmare, though I'll believe you heard the fight he was having with his own unit to try and get to your place to kill Timothy for touching you. He's pretty much been a raging beast ever since his first bond was broken so badly. Oh, is that what that was about? I thought it was because there was another man hanging out with his pups. Derek shook his head. That wouldn't set us off. You are our mate, Kellen, and a man going into your apartment with an overnight bag. Havoc did not handle it well. That is completely on you. I did not know you were my mate. On that note, when did you know I was your mate? She had wanted to know that for hours now. She knew now from all of the comments she recalled from his alpha unit that they all knew, that was why they were in the city always on her. She just hadn't known it then. The moment you walked into my office, he sighed, and looked right at her. Not a good day for either of us. You were absolutely terrified of me, and Havoc's utter rage over your injured condition, his mate so badly wounded, I could barely contain him from bursting out of me and going on a killing spree. But Elle believes, that is not how you took it. Your fear was just increasing with every minute you were in the office, in front of us. Why didn't you say anything? Kellen sighed. She couldn't understand it. Did you not want us? She couldn't help the bit of pain that was in her words. Because you didn't react to us at all, you had no idea, did you? Could not send us because there was no Arya. And yes, I wanted you, Havoc screaming and clawing in my head, wanting to claim you instantly, damn near ripped out of me to mark you on the spot. He's uncontrollable and unpredictable at times. But with your fear levels, I didn't let him. I could barely get a word out myself due to having to put so much effort into containing him. Elle apologized for that. How it went down. And I do understand why you were scared of me, after what you heard me say. I would never actually do that, I was just so that you kept defying me. Who in their right mind, Kellen, ignores or blatantly refuses their alpha's order? I didn't know why you wanted me to come home. You were the one who ordered me to leave and never come back. When I got your letter to come home, she shrugged, your order on me was technically still in effect. I don't believe that. He shot right at her, a frown on his face. The letter quite clearly requested you to come home and had my name on it. That would have overridden the previous order, you just didn't want to. Okay, you're right, I didn't want to. There was no way I was going to come home and present myself with my children in front of you and your Luna, a woman who hated me, a woman who would never stand for some bastard children threatening her children's right to be alpha to the pack. That would have put them in direct danger, and I will always protect them, even from you. Kellen, he frowned at her. I would never hurt them. I did not know that at the time. I had been gone 6 years and had no contact with your pack, knew nothing of what was going on. You know it now, right? Yes, Derek, I know you would never hurt them. I saw it for myself today. It had hurt a little to know that they had never gotten to have that, their whole lives, to only have it now. They were probably both to blame. She guessed on that. Kellen drained the last of her wine, and leaned back in her chair to just stare at him for a long minute. I have one more question. Ask. Why didn't you let Jackson or Steven just tell me that I was your mate? Would you have believed it? Honestly, Kellen. She thought about it for a full minute, then shook her head. No, I would have thought it was a ploy to get me to bring your children to you, because this whole time all I thought was that you wanted them. I knew and Arya knew we were not your mate, so what other reason would it be? She stood up from the table. Neither of them had eaten anything, dinner was a bust and information overload. I'm tired, Derek, my head hurts and I need to take all this in before I can decide on anything. He stood and, without warning, stepped over to her and leaned down and kissed her. His mouth was on hers, moving on hers hungrily, his hand moved up into her hair and pulled hard on her braid. Her head was pulled back by the force and she gasped a little, pain and pleasure at the same time. His tongue was suddenly moving against hers, and his other hand was on her back and bringing her body hard up against his. Every fiber of her being was suddenly screaming at her to get closer, to taste him. She kissed him back with just as much need as he was displaying for her. She lost herself instantly, only knowing how right it felt to be in his arms, to have his mouth on hers, to be kissed by him. Her eyes fluttered closed and her hands curled into his shirt. She pressed herself against him. She missed him so much. Goddess, she wanted him, to be with him, for him to claim her. It was all she had ever wanted. She had no idea how long he stood there, his mouth on hers, tasting every inch of her, stealing her breath away from her, his hands gripped in her hair and grinding his body against hers and she against his in response, only that it was abruptly gone. He'd stepped back from her and was now staring at her, his eyes so dark and filled with desire they were almost black. She had no idea why he'd stepped back, why he'd pulled away. "I want you, Kellen, don't ever doubt that. You should go now before I mark and mate you, before you are ready for it. I want you to want it, wholeheartedly want us, so I will wait. You need to leave this room before I lose all control." Kellen stood staring at him. She heard what he said. Arya was yelling at her to stay put to let him mark and mate her, and she wondered if Havoc was arguing with Derek. In the same way, he could have marked her right here and now, she wouldn't have stopped him. "Thank you for knowing I am not really ready," she nodded slowly and then turned and walked out of the room in a little bit of a daze. He appeared to have more self-awareness than she did, way more self-control too. She was pretty certain that he knew he could have taken what he wanted right there on the dining room table, marked and mated her at will. His kiss had been her undoing. She was never going to reject him. How could she? He really did want her. She bit her lip and made her way up to the Alpha suite. She let herself in to find all four of their parents sitting there. They all turned and looked at her, stared at her to be exact, saw her mother raise an eyebrow at her. She said nothing, just headed for the hallway where the children were sleeping. Still somewhat out of it, she couldn't seem to shake it off, and a little confused to be truthful. It had been less than a day and she could feel she felt differently about him already. Their mate bond was indeed very strong. In less than a day she knew she would be his, it was just a matter of when, now she guessed. Kellen checked on each of the children. They were all settled in their beds and found an empty room at the end to go into. She stepped into the bathroom and glanced at herself in the mirror. It was no wonder they were all staring at her. Her hair was a complete mess from where his hand had been in it. Somewhere along the line he had pulled the entire braid out, and her hair was hanging loosely around her face, more than a little messy. Her lipstick was gone and her lips slightly swollen from all the kissing, and she was very flushed in the face. It was not hard to tell they had gotten hot and heavy during dinner. Chapter 39. Derek POV. Havoc was annoyed with him to say the least. He could have marked and mated her right there in the private dining room. Had wanted to, but chosen not to. He really had meant it when he'd told her he wanted her to wholeheartedly want them. As much as his wolf was ticked off and annoyed with him, as much as his desire burned inside of him and made his alpha blood boil for his mate. He would wait for her to come to him. Her reaction to his kiss said it all, but the only reason he had kissed her was because he had thought she was going to say something that would cause him serious pain, that she was still thinking about rejecting him. "Before I can decide on anything." Those words had caused his heart to ache instantly. It wasn't a rejection, but it meant she still wasn't ready to accept him either. He knew dinner had been horrible, talking through everything, hearing her tell him she'd felt lonely and unwanted had nearly killed him, because he knew, it was he who'd caused her to feel that way. He had kissed her simply out of a need to show her that he wanted her, that he would always want her. She had kissed him back and he had taken advantage of her need to be wanted and feel loved and cherished. He'd known even while he was kissing out of her this was not the answer, this was not the way. And that she would likely regret it afterwards, and so had dragged his hot and aroused body away from hers before he'd ripped her dress off and took what he wanted, whether she would regret it afterwards or not. The way she had stood and stared at him after the kiss, her green eyes dark and so filled with desire as much as his were, her hands were still held up in front of her as though still holding on to him, but she looked very confused. She simply didn't understand why he hadn't seduced her all the way. He knew, her desire and his had filled this room, it was flooding out of the both of them, but he wanted their marking and mating to actually be her choice. It was clear to her though, that he wanted it, his wolf wanted it. He knew Arya did too, but Kellen was an unknown emotional mess on the inside, to him, and he couldn't push her into overload. It might not go down so well. He watched as she thanked him and then just turned and walked out the room. He really wanted to go after her and hug her to him. She'd looked more than a little lost, very confused, and though not upset at all, just kind of out of it, he thought. He hoped he hadn't already broken her emotional state. He walked to the door and watched her go. She merely strolled down the hall, he followed her at a distance, her behavior odd. She hadn't gotten angry with him or glared at him in annoyance for taking liberties with her. He watched as she turned the corner, and he headed down the hall to follow her. She strolled seemingly in a daze all the way to the elevator and pressed the button. Stephen appeared next to him. Derek had asked him earlier to not be far away in case she had a complete meltdown and he was needed. He was watching her as well. He'd been sitting on one of the couches in the front living area, probably watching TV. He glanced at Derek when she stepped into the elevator and shrugged, not getting anything, boss. Odd to say the least, kind of expected her to beat me actually. What did you do? Kissed out of her, he answered honestly. Where do you think she's going? Stephen chuckled. You're sweet, I imagine, isn't that where the pups are? They are, he nodded. Do you think Elle broke her? No, I've seen broken, I think she is stunned maybe. But you didn't get any distress off of her, anger, anything? Nothing boss, kind of like she's not really there, autopilot mode I'm guessing. Did you talk it out, or did you spend the whole time attached at the lips? We talked, but I don't know, Elle got this weird feeling, not a good feeling, and when she stood to leave the room I just got up and kissed her. That's the aftermath of a kiss. Stephen stared at him, then laughed at him. Boss, you know you can't deprive the brain of oxygen or it stops working. Derek turned his eyes on his gamma and punched him. Idiot. What? How long did you steal her breath away from her for? I don't know. Derek shrugged. Till I realized I was about to mate and mark her, I guess. Ah, so a long time boss. Stephen walked away. Don't worry about it, I'm sure she is fine, she certainly isn't distressed about it, boss. Perhaps just leave her for now and try again tomorrow. Yeah, he nodded. It had been an emotional roller coaster today, though for him in a good way, but he was still tired. He wandered into his office and sat down to give her a chance to settle down for the night. He rested his head on the back of the couch and stared blankly at the ceiling. A smile touched his face as he thought about her and their children. He couldn't get the picture of her sitting on the bed in Nate's room with all three of them staring at Havoc out of his mind, his family right there in his suite. Soon Havoc huffed at him. Hopefully buddy, let's just give her time, she needs to adjust. Hey, it's not even been a day. Arya, he whined. I know you want to be with her, it will happen, she is your mate and you know she is not going anywhere. What did you do to the girl? His mother's voice popped into his head via the mind link. Nothing, just kissed her. You sure, son? Positive, mother. Looked like you had your way with her without marking her. I did no such thing, sent her away before Lee lost control. How is she? Quiet, how was she when she left you? Derek really didn't like that turn of phrase and neither did Havoc either. Kellen was quiet when she left the dining room. So she is there then? Checked on the children and turned herself in for the night. We are all headed off now. Don't be disheartened, son, it's not even been a day. I know. I'm not, and he wasn't. He knew it was going to take time. He also knew that Havoc would growl and be annoyed and angry with him for taking so long, but he would do it the right way. He didn't want to mark and mate her only to have turn around and accuse him of forcing her into it, and he knew Havoc didn't either. We can sneak in and cuddle her when she sleeps, sneak out before she wakes up, Havoc chortled. When on earth did you become so cheeky and naughty? Derek laughed to himself. It wasn't a bad idea. He had no idea if he could sneak into her room without her scenting him and waking her. An interesting thought though. We used to played with Arya lots when she was younger. Derek thought on that one, and yes, he supposed Havoc would always enjoy chasing Arya around the pack, hunting her and pouncing on her when they found her, him bowling her over when she was in a full run trying to outrun him, and they would end up tumbling over each other until Havoc was standing directly above her tiny wolf, she between his front paws, lying on the ground all submissive. It was very dominant of him as he would stare down at her with that "you can't outrun me" look, and then playfully swat her with his paw, to get her up and moving again, to give her a head start for another chase. Sat on her more than once. Havoc chortled at him, she was so tiny, easy to dominate. Not so little now, Derek mused. Ah, but she still enjoyed me pouncing on her and dominating her. There was pride in his voice. He was very happy about mating his mate. Derek stood, they would head for their suite, he would like to be close to her and the children. It was the first time they would be all staying in the Alpha suite, their new home. Finally, he had his family under his roof, though still not his Luna in his bed, but he would get that too, just a matter of time. He took the stairs, a slow easy walk up to the top floor, and pushed through the doors to his suite. He didn't want her to think he was stalking her, so he didn't check on the children. He knew they were all right. Hit the shower and crawled into his bed naked, as he always did, hated wearing clothes to bed, looked at the empty pillow next to him and sighed. Soon. He thought he would be able to wake up and she would be right there sleeping next to him, right there for him to reach out and touch, right there to wake up first thing in the morning and... Nope, I can't think that one through with her only down the hall. Sneak down to her, cuddle her, he heard Havoc remind him playfully. Derek liked this side of his beast. He had been worried that her anger and his anger were going to be a problem, that they might feed off of each other and get worse, but it seemed the mate bond was doing as it was supposed to, evening out each other's flaws. Maybe tomorrow, let's give her space tonight, okay? Just one night in the Alpha suite. Where she can learn we won't mate and mark her unwittingly during the night, make her feel safe, secure, and okay with being in our suite. Havoc huffed but didn't argue. Chapter 40. Kellen POV. Showered and lying in the bed, due to the fact she had no clothes here in the room to change into, she stared up at the ceiling. She had been awake for hours, unable to get any sleep, her mind was unable to switch off. And Arya was of no help to her, all she could think about was her mate and wanting to be with him. Go to him, was all she'd been harping on for nearly an hour now. Not ready. Arya had snorted at her, almost angry with her, you wanted him earlier. Yes, I know, but that was different. Caught off guard. Arya snorted at her in annoyance. You want him? Arya sighed almost softly. She was lying in Kellen's mind, head on her paws and tail around her. You remember when he used to kiss you? Your whole body melted into him. Enough, Arya. It was like that, but today is more intense. You want him, need him. She whispered to her. Arya. Kellen was practically begging her to stop it, her wolf was trying to rile her up and she knew it. She rolled over on the bed and buried her face into the pillow. The way his hands would slide over you, touch you, softly at first, she was purring softly, now his mouth kissing your neck. Kellen growled at her own wolf. She didn't need to be reminded of what it was like to be in his arms, to have him touch her everywhere, taste every inch of her. Bite her gently and then roughly. She flipped over on the bed and huffed herself. Arya, let it go, she muttered. The way he'd pull you towards him and lick all the way up your spine before lacing his fingers into yours while sliding his huge barred C0CK against you, teasing you when he knew what you really wanted. Arya was all hindquarters up inside Kellen's mind, as though she could actually feel it. Enough please, Kellen begged her, quietly biting her lp. It'll never be enough, Arya whispered softly, his hand between your legs, touching you, stroking you, filling you with pleasure. You remember, don't you, the feeling, how hot you got, how et you would be. How wanton he made you. Goddess help me. Kellen sent up a silent prayer. She did remember and was at this very minute turned on by the memory her wolf was pushing at her. With her eyes closed, Goddess, she could picture it so clearly, the way he would look down at her with those desire-filled deep dark blue eyes of his, the way she would drown in them, loved looking up into them, knowing he wanted her, needed her, was unable to look away from him even when she was so close to him. He loved to watch her. He'd told her often, sometimes had even demanded her not to look away from him, as he'd pleasured her, his long rough fingers stroking her most sensitive places until she was arched up and crying out his name. Kellen M0ANED into her room, her hand slipping down her body, touching herself the way she knew he would, imagining her hand was his hand. Go to him. Arya whispered into her mind. Don't even know if he's in his room, she whispered back to Arya. Mind link him. Goddess, no. He'll know instantly I'm turned on. Oh Goddess, she needed release. She claimed an image in her mind of him. Good, we want him to. No. Kellen could taste blood. She'd had to bite down hard to keep from calling out his name. Go to him. If he's not there. She feared she would not have the courage to go to his bed again if she went and he wasn't there. I sense my mate nearby, he is there. Arya whispered to her. Go to him. Kellen sat up in the bed. Her body ached for him. She did want to go to him, but what if he wasn't there? What if she went and found his bed empty? What then? She was biting her lp nervously. Never nervous before, not even your first time with him. Why now? Arya asked. Different now. What if it's not the same? She worried. Arya snorted at her and shot the image of her and him kissing in the private dining room into her mind. Kellen M0ANED as she recalled the hungriness, the wanton need. Goddess, the way she could feel his hard erection pressed against her, how she'd not been able to stop herself from moving herself against it. She tossed the covers back and got out of bed, slipped from her room and quietly walked down the hallway and into the living area. Before she changed her mind, and talked herself out of it. She was completely had no idea if he was even in his room, though his scent was here and quite strong. That could just be because it was his room. She tipped across the living area and stood by his bedroom door. Go to him. Arya whispered in her mind. You want him, we want him. He wants you, they want us. She reached out and, taking a deep breath, opened his door and stepped into his bedroom quietly. Closed the door softly behind her. There he was lying in his bed, sleeping on his stomach, his face turned away from her, the duvet only covering him to his waist. She could see him perfectly clearly with her wolf's sight. Arya was purring softly inside her mind. He's yours, Kellen, go claim him. Goddess, he was perfect, all those muscles, even in his relaxed state of sleep, were a turn on. She took a step towards his bed, took another, and then his head turned and his eyes were on her. She knew he could see her, his sight perfect even in the dark. She bit her lp, Her heart rate quickened, she could smell her own arousal, from a few minutes ago it still lingered on her quite strongly, she could tell he could too, his nostrils were flared as he lay there breathing in deeply, smelling her. He pushed himself up with his arms, never took his eyes off of hers. She watched as all his muscles rippled while he moved, her breath quickened, she wanted him so much, had missed him so much, felt the heat of desire pool between her thighs, felt tears welling in her eyes. This was all she had wanted her whole life, to be his, and now here it was, she was his, he was hers. She watched from midway across the room as he flicked the duvet away from his body, could see he was already fully aroused and ready for her. The smell of her arousal would likely have been what had woken him. Without a word held out his arms to her, she couldn't stop herself, ran across to the bed and climbed in, reached out for him and pressed her lips to his, kissed him with everything she had, sliding her arms around his neck, pressing her whole body against his, slid herself directly underneath him, pulling at him to feel his hard body against hers. His mouth was devouring hers, she felt him shift completely on top of her and press her down onto the mattress, a hand already pulling at her thigh, so he could have her, take what the goddess had gifted to him. His mouth moved from hers, his deep blue eyes locked on hers. Mine, he growled right at her, both he and Havoc together, and she growled it right back. Mine, her and Arya united in accepting their mates completely. His mouth smashed down onto hers and she felt him thrust barred into her, all the way in, deep and hard, dominating, claiming her completely. She thrust up to meet him, so ready for him, wanted nothing more than to be mated and marked by H.P. He thrust his hard C0CK in and out of her slowly, firmly, all the way in deep as he could go, and Kellen arched up to him, wanting him to fill her completely. It was like nothing she'd felt before with him. With every movement of his body she felt electricity shooting through her. Her gasps of pleasure came quickly, as he started to move quicker, she matched him, her need to have him increasing like never before. Her nails were scratching down his back, her heels pushing hard into the mattress beneath her to aid in her getting what she wanted. He was thrusting furiously in and out of her now, mating her with everything he had, claiming her utterly. She was his. Pain ripped through her as his fangs plunged deep into the tender skin of her mark spot. It was intensely hot and felt as though she was being burned by his venom, but it faded quickly away. Then she was pushing at his chest, to try and shove him over. My turn, she whispered to him. He allowed her to roll him over. She pushed him down and sat up, looking down at him as she started to ride him. He was smiling up at her. Your turn, he agreed. Kellen pushed his hands away from her body when he tried to touch her, grabbed him by his wrists and used all her wolf strength to pin him down, hold him down while she kissed him and rode him hard and fast. He wanted to touch her, strained at her tight grip. She smiled down at him, was much stronger than before. He didn't want her dominating him and she liked it, her last act of defiance, holding him down and getting what she wanted from him. A growl came from him and she was abruptly overpowered by him, Havoc lending his strength. He set them up, pushing her hands behind her back. He grabbed both her wrists in one hand and held them there. His other hand had a fistful of her hair and tugged her head back, his mouth claimed hers. Defiant to the end, I see, he growled playfully. Always she teased him, pulled her arms free of his hold, wrapped them around his neck and kissed him again. She would never tire of kissing this man. Felt Arya howl with happiness, and heard Havoc howl right back at her, as the connection between their two wolves was solidified. Tears burned in her eyes as she felt through the bond, just how much he did love her, did want her. They spilled down her cheeks and she burst into tears and buried her face into his neck as sobs racked her body. Sweetheart, it's okay, he whispered to her softly. She knew he could feel what she was feeling, her turbulent emotions were unchecked, and probably a little out of control, but she was just really happy and couldn't contain them right that minute. Her alpha loved her and that was all she had ever wanted. She could feel his hands moving gently up and down her back trying to soothe her. Had no idea how long she sat there with him unable to gain control of herself or her emotions. "I'm sorry," she murmured sometime later. "Don't you ever be sorry for loving me the way you do." His voice was a little rough. He shifted them to lie down on the bed, gently withdrew himself from her. She whimpered a little, and he chuckled softly. "Want to go again, hey?" Kellen buried her face into his chest but smiled at the same time and couldn't help it. She whacked him playfully on the shoulder but knew he was right. She wanted to spend the rest of the night with him, touching him, teasing him, pleasing him, and being pleased by him. She knew she would only have to ask. Probably wouldn't have to ask at all. His hand was already stroking her outer thigh. He was going to be insatiable and, to be honest, she wanted that. Chapter 41. Derek POV. He lay on his side propped up on an elbow, watching her sleep, a smile on his lips, Kellen right where she should be. Her hair was all messy from him grabbing at it all night and all morning. For that matter, she'd never be allowed to cut it off. Her mark spot was right there for him to see. A pretty silver filigree now adorned the soft skin just below the crook of her neck. He loved just looking at it, refrained from touching it, though he wanted to. He knew it would wake her from her sleep and set off her arousal as well. He'd tormented her with it plenty already. He internally chuckled to himself. He'd been watching her for an hour now, unable to move away. He didn't want her to wake up alone. He wanted to see those big green eyes of hers open and he to be the first thing she sees even if it took all day. He wasn't moving out of this bed for anything. He had already informed his parents and his alpha unit, too darned happy to be able to keep it to himself. His mother had practically screamed down the link in joy and started yelling about getting Varys so they could start working on the Luna ceremony which would be on the next full moon just 10 days away. Then the link had been severed and he could well imagine she was already linking Vera. They'd always gotten along as had both of their fathers. It seemed things were going to go back to the way they had before he had screwed everything up. His alpha unit had not been all that surprised. Jackson simply told him to take the day, boss, a knowingly playful tone in his voice. Derek understood his meaning, and he was doing just that, taking the day to be with her. His eyes moved over her body. It was uncovered from the waist up. She was lying flat on her stomach, her face turned towards him, one hand up under the pillow, the other stretched out down the bed. She'd fallen asleep with him on top of her, begged him to stay there, said she loved the feel of his weight on her body. And how could he deny her anything when she used the word loves and him in the same sentence? He'd slipped off of her when she'd nodded off to sleep. There were many tiny bite marks down her back. He knew there were even more across her chest and abdomen. A grin formed on his face, inside of her thighs too. Every little love bite he'd left had elicited moans of pleasure from her, and he'd wanted to hear more with the release of his mouth and her moan dying off. He'd found another place to tease and please her. He watched her green eyes slowly open. He was still grinning and he knew it, couldn't help it. "Afternoon, sweetheart," his voice dropped to that deep tone he knew would turn her on. Watched as she bit her lip and stared at him, then turned her face and buried it into the pillow, with a little shake of her head, almost as if she was shy and embarrassed. "Ah, you went all shy, have you?" he teased her gently. "Go away," she muttered into her pillow. Her tone was too light. He laughed. He knew she didn't mean it. She was just grumpy first thing in the morning or when waking up. He recalled that much. "Nope," and he reached out and poked her right between her last two ribs, knowing she was ticklish there. She swatted at him, her face still buried in the pillow. He dodged her easily. "Come now, sweetheart, swatting at me like that might get your mate all frisky again." He got the desired response. Her eyes moved back to him, at the word mate. He winked right at her and then pointed to his mark spot. Her eyes moved to it and she actually blushed. Goddess, well, look at that, he thought. He could still make her blush. Come here, he growled. She shook her head. No, 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 you've had enough. Never, he growled again and yanked her across the bed to hug her to his chest. She squealed and struggled against him, but she was no match for him. She'd learned that last night, so had Arya when Havoc had decided it was his turn to mate his mate in human form. Poor Wolf had no chance, even though she had fought for dominance. Havoc was much stronger and their rough play had been something to sit back and watch. Even Kellen was a little shocked by their behavior, even more so, when Arya had receded to the back of her mind but Havoc had not, was staring right down at her, growling mine at her. She'd had to persuade him to relinquish control back to Derek. His wolf wanted to mate her too, it seemed. Derek had pulled him away with not a no, but a later buddy. To his surprise, so had Kellen. They could talk about that another time. It wasn't all that usual for wolves in human form to mate a human counterpart to their actual mate, but clearly his was interested. Derek wondered if it was Havoc wanting to dominate her or if he too felt the need to claim not just Arya but Kellen as well. Currently, Havoc was settled and sleeping. They could discuss it later. Her squirming to get away was only increasing his interest in her, and he held on that little bit tighter to elicit more fight from her. She abruptly stilled when she realized what was going on and found his fully erect C0CK against her abdomen. You bastard, she half-heartedly yelled at him and struck him quite hard on his back. He started to laugh and couldn't stop, rolled them over. She was on top of him and grinned right up at her. What? You started it. Moving and grinding yourself all over me, what did think was gonna happen? She pushed up and climbed off of him. He let her go. Yes, he was still interested in having his way with her, but he was pretty sure she actually did need rest and recovery time. She flicked the sheet over him and muttered, "Down, boy." Which only made him laugh again. Where are the children? She asked. With my parents playing with Holly, he answered and rolled back onto his side. To watch her, she was sitting completely naked in front of him. He liked it. She'd never been one to be shy about her body, or not around him anyway. You want to go shower and get some food? You must be hungry after all your seduction of me last night. Her eyes widened as he knew they would. She technically was responsible for him mating out of her. She'd come in here all hot and bothered, smelling so strongly of arousal, and then climbed underneath him, and he was never going to let her forget it. Her willpower is tiny. His obviously much stronger, or at least that was how he was going to tease her from now on. There was suddenly a pillow banged into his face, and the hits kept coming, till he gave up defending himself and threw himself at her, pinned her down. What, sweetheart, did you forget you came in here to me, already? He feigned utter shock with the last word. She grumbled, but still smiled. I know, you used to say that to me all the time. Guess not much has changed. Then he climbed up off of her and yanked her from the bed. Come on, shower, we got stuff that still needs fixing, you know. What? He turned the shower on and stepped in when it was to his liking, pulled her in and took great pleasure in washing her from head to toe, touching her everywhere. It was not a quick shower in the end, and she was whacking him, telling him to stop touching her, trying to get away from him while she was trying to dry off. Ah, she was so much fun to play with. Their bond was so strong. He could feel it. They were going to be just fine. Once all the human world stuff was cleaned up, he knew she had things to sort out back in the city, a job to quit, a boyfriend to dump. She could do those both over the phone though, and an apartment to clean out and pack up, though he could have people do that last part. Probably would. He wondered how she'd feel about him tagging along for all of that. If she insisted on doing it in person, he was not likely to allow her to go all the way across the country without him ever again. He could well imagine both the looks on those men's faces when he was suddenly by her side and completely unexpectedly announced as her fiancé in the human world. Firstly, though she had to drop the charges against him, so he could go with her to close out her human world life, and he would be going with her. He was not leaving her alone for a single second with either Eric Stanton or Timothy Bolton, for that matter, not that he thought she would do anything to hurt him, he just didn't want any unmated male wolves near her, nor unmarried human males for that matter. They might come to blows today over it, but she was his now, and she had to deal with him and his temper and dominant possessive tendencies. He thought it was going to be fun. He doubted she was going to think that, but let's see her be defiant now. The conversation about closing out her human life was going as he expected. She was currently standing in his office with her hands on her H.P.S. glaring at him. He'd simply informed her that she could end everything and close it all out with a few phone calls, or that he would be tagging along with her wherever she went, and this had put her into fight mode. "You don't trust me," she accused him. "Yes, I do. I just am not willing to let you out of my sight this very minute. I just got you," he told her without lying. His whole unit was sitting in his office watching the two of them go head to head, and he didn't actually care. It was kind of like old times, the five of them hanging out together. "That is ridiculous." "What? You think I am going to run off, do you? Like I could, Arya would drag me back here." He was staring at her now. He didn't like the way she had said that, implying she was only here because of Arya. He put down the pen he had been using and leaned back in his chair to look at her. She was wearing an outfit he'd bought for her, black jeans that buttoned to the H.P. and a green long-sleeve sweater that stopped at her waist. Her lower abdomen was on display, very distracting. She had a whole wardrobe full of clothes in their suite which had surprised her, including the gown he had picked out and wanted her to wear to her Luna ceremony. She'd even liked it. A nice deep blue mermaid-style dress with crystals embedded in it to make it look like the night sky. It was actually the same color as his eyes. He didn't think she would run off at all, but her choice of words irked him anyway. "Say that again," he stated softly. There was a slight edge to his voice, his annoyance for all to hear. He watched her think about what she had said. A hand came up. Her fingers were moving as she was running the words through her mind. He watched it dawn on her, acknowledged what she had implied right here in front of him and his unit, and shook her head slowly. "Poor choice of words," she agreed. "Agreed. You have two choices, Kellen. Personally I like choice L. You sit in your office here in the pack." He pointed to a door off to his right on the other side of the room. "And call Eric and resign from your job. You call Timothy and end your relationship with him. I don't care what you tell him, to be honest, just make it clear to him it's over. And you call the feds and speak with them and drop the charges against me. If you choose option 2, I will be going with you for every aspect of your departure from the human world, including that very uncomfortable conversation you will have to have with Timothy about me while I am standing right next to you. I can assure you Havoc will be all dominant and his hands will be on you to make the point loud and clear as to who you belong to. It will not be something I will be able to control." "You're impossible," she snapped at him. "I could be, yes, but for once you will do as I tell you, yes." He threw the question at her to see if she was going to continue to defy him at every turn. She was standing there staring at him, hadn't answered the question, but her green eyes were all defiant. He heard all three of his friends burst out laughing, and frowned at them. Still got a defiant mate, Jackson laughed at him. Life surely is about to get interesting around here, boss. Kellen, choice L or 2. Her jaw was ticking away and her fists were balled at her sides. He was not the least bit surprised to sense anger from her. For the past 6 years she had been answerable only to herself, and her wolf. But now she was mated to her alpha and accountable for all her actions to him. He would never truly punish her in any way, and that wasn't fun for either of them. He did like her defiance in a small way, her stubbornness, and was happy to play with her even if she didn't know that was what he was doing. Pushing her buttons was going to be fun, which is what he was doing right that minute, she just hadn't figured it out yet. I'll take option 1 then, shall I? She snapped at him and stomped off to her Luna's office. He smiled to himself when she banged the door shut. Life was indeed about to get interesting and he couldn't wait. The end. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.